The stereotypes prevailing in society form the views that power is exercised by legislative, executive, and judicial systems. However, as follows from our previous programs, in reality, governance is implemented by a supranational system of conceptual power, which includes 6 governorial priorities. The fourth of them, in terms of significance, is the economic priority, world money as information on paper or electronic media about means of payment. The banking system operates with money. The system, which at certain stages of the development of this or that statehood may de facto go out of its jurisdiction. Suffice it to recall the third part of Article 1 of the law on the Central Bank of the RSFSR, Bank of Russia, adopted on December 2, 1990. The Bank of Russia fulfills the functions and exercises the powers stipulated in the Constitution of the Russian Federation and in the present federal law, independently of other federal state power bodies, of the state power bodies of the subjects of the Russian Federation, and of local self-government bodies. It should be understood that in any country in the world, contrary to healthy thinking, creating a central financial institution independent of the government means that it is subordinate to the corporation of international banking clans and performs the function of their intermediary in this country. At the same time, the country loses its economic sovereignty.
What other schemes for governance towards the country's money are possible? We are so accustomed to regarding the central bank in our country, the Federal Reserve System in the US, as inevitable attributes of statehood. Wasn't it always this way?
Such schemes of governance towards money arose only at the stage of total dominance of the biblical conception of governance, with a radical change in the system of state arrangement. Until 1990, we had in circulation on equal terms the bills of the State Bank of the USSR and state treasury notes, which differed only in face value. All the incomes from their issuance and circulation were state property. At the same time, the State Bank was a budgetary organization. Ordinary civil servants with very concrete abilities and salaries coped with the work in it. Until 1913, the USA also had a state financial system, the US Treasury and national banks. The struggle to create a similar private corporation, the Federal Reserve System, FRS, in the USA was much more fierce, lasted for decades, was accompanied by bloodshed, and ended only in December 1913. The scenario of US subordination to international bankers is described in the famous book by Ralph Epperson, The Unseen Hand. Here are some fragmentary excerpts from it in order to trace the relationship between the scenarios of the US Federal Reserve and the Central Bank of Russia. After a series of unsuccessful attempts to convince the American people of the need for a central bank by dragging them into a series of wars, the international bankers associated with the conspiracy decided to change their methods. For this objective, instead of using wars, they decided to convince gullible American citizens that they needed a central bank, using artificially created depressions, recessions, and panics. The first serious panic was created by international bankers in 1893, when local bankers across the country were asked to demand repayment for their loans. Senator Robert Owen testified before a congressional commission that the bank he owned received from the National Bankers Association what came to be known as the Panic Circular of 1893. It stated, "You will at once retire 1/3 of your circulation and call in 1/2 of your loans." Notice that the conspirators did not want the American people to know what they had in store for them: a central bank. The legislation was to be written not by a group of legislators, but by a group of bankers, mostly connected with the man responsible for the Panic of 1907, J.P. Morgan. The conspiracy also had one additional problem. They had to avoid the name central bank, and for that reason they had come upon the designation of the Federal Reserve System. It would be owned by private individuals who would draw profit from ownership of shares and who would control the nation's issue of money. It would have at its command the nation's entire financial resources, and it would be able to mobilize and mortgage the United States by involving it in major foreign wars. The plot worked. Wilson was elected and then inaugurated in January 1913. Wilson could now sign the Federal Reserve Bill in December 1913 after it had passed the House and the Senate, and he did. World War I and World War II, organized after that, undermined the currencies of the warring powers and led the owners of the dollar issuance to a monopoly on the globe, and in 1944 the dollar became the only currency backed by gold de jure. Any country that signed the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 was automatically addicted to the dollar needle, because it was required to have dollar paper in order to back up its own money. Further on, Epperson writes, "The instrument of economic destruction was now in place. The staffing of the system's key positions with those who created and supported it followed. In fact, America's elected officials know that the Federal Reserve System is not federal." One of those who saw how this was the result of prior economic planning was Congressman Lindbergh, who in 1921 wrote in his book Economic Pinch the following: "Under the Federal Reserve Act, panics are scientifically created. The present panic is the first scientifically created one, worked out as we figure a mathematical problem." On May 23, 1933, McFadden brought impeachment charges against the Federal Reserve Board, the agency he thought had caused the stock market crash of 1929. With these charges, among others, "I charge them with having taken over $80 billion from the United States government in the year 1928. I charge them with having arbitrarily and unlawfully raised and lowered the rates on money, increased and diminished the volume of currency in circulation for the benefit of private interests." If we analyze everything that happens in the United States after the creation of the Federal Reserve System, then we cannot but agree with the conclusions of Ralph Epperson. In other words, the system was created to do exactly the opposite of what it tells the American people. The system is working. The new law will create inflation whenever the trusts want inflation. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. The congressman had put his finger on the pulse of the problem. The Federal Reserve System was created to foster economic emergencies. This instrument of economic destruction was now in place. If in this text we replace the word American people with Russian people and attribute this phrase not to the FRS but to the central bank, then we will not find a single inaccuracy in these thoughts.
Could you dwell in the same detail on the system of our central bank? As I know, you worked as chairman of the board of a commercial bank for 5 years, and you have a first-hand view on these problems.
The Bank of Russia is the same age as perestroika, and in my opinion, it is the key link in all the destructive phenomena that have taken place. The impression is created that it was precisely for this purpose, that it was created as an economically independent legal entity in accordance with the RSFSR law of December 2, 1990, on the central bank of the RSFSR, Bank of Russia. Its authorized capital amounted to a modest amount of 3 billion rubles in old money. Before talking about the functions, let's try to understand the essence of the legal status of the central bank and who owns it. Note that the President's administration has repeatedly posed the question of its nationalization. Let us quote an important for us passage from the law, which cannot fail to shake the imagination of any of the great schemers. Ostap Bender never dreamed of such a thing. The Bank of Russia performs the functions and exercises the powers stipulated by the Constitution of the Russian Federation and the federal law on the Central Bank of the Russian Federation, Bank of Russia, independently from the federal bodies of state power, regional authorities, and local governments. The financial independence of the Bank of Russia implies that it covers its expenses from its own income. The state is not liable for the obligations of the Bank of Russia, and similarly, the Bank of Russia is not liable for the obligations of the state. As you can see, not a trace has remained of Article Number 1 that the bank is in fact owned by the RSFSR. After all, the property right is realized primarily as the right to govern, and the governance towards profits is always the exclusive prerogative of the owner. It is not employees who share the profits in any joint stock company. From these positions, the central bank can be regarded exclusively as a private corporation, with a level of remuneration which differs by far from the level of remuneration of civil servants. Recently, attempts have been made to somehow powder the obvious absurdities, where a private company on a monopolistic basis itself prints all the country's money, puts it on its balance sheet, minus the cost of paint and paper, and it itself, without paying any taxes like grain growers or miners do, receives a usurious income that is unheard of in the history of humanity. The amount of only the percentage component of this income is numerically equal to the money supply provided also to the Ministry of Finance, multiplied by the base rate of the central bank. There is no connection between this income and the labor activity of the central bank. To prove that the central bank is an instrument of destroying the country, Let us turn to Article 5 of the Law on the Bank of Russia. The main tasks of the Bank of Russia are regulation of money circulation, ensuring the stability of the ruble, protecting the interests of the bank depositors, and overseeing the activities of commercial banks. This is by announcement. In fact, we see that the system was created to do exactly the opposite of what it tells the American, Russian people. In these years, we had a complete collapse of the ruble money circulation, falls down to 10 to 15% of the needs of the total flow of goods. The ruble fell by tens of thousands of times. It is difficult to find depositors whose interests would not be infringed on, and who would not be restored by the efforts of the central bank. You will not find commercial banks whose large-scale thefts would have been prevented in time. A chain of such coincidences testifies to the clear intentionality of everything that happened under the scientific leadership of the central bank. And you really can't deny wisdom here, because it is simply impossible not to place in the Guinness Book of World Records the one who carried out an operation of depreciating money by tens of thousands of times in the richest country within several years, in the absence of external aggression, civil war. In fact, only our Hercules, the chairman of the central bank of the modern era, could do it. Without the central bank, it would be impossible by any stretch of the imagination to realize what happened, even theoretically, because in the state bank system, all funds taken from the industries would go to the state treasury. Listening to the reports to the president, one can see that in the vocabulary of the government are predominantly dollars. Amazingly, not a single lawyer has challenged agreements made on behalf of the state, for example, for renting premises for foreign currencies, which is contrary to Article number 10 of the Constitution of the Russian Federation. The most significant frauds take place today in the system of monetary circulation. We continue to export all the country's resources in exchange for the doomed dollar waste paper. The exchange is carried out in such a way that for 10 kilograms of dollar paper stored in the basements of the central bank, we give 100 kilograms of gold, as well as oil, timber, gas, aluminium, and so on. All insane borrowings were carried out by our country in dollars. But before it began to go down in relation to the euro, up to 70% of our debt was transferred from dollars to euros. As a result, with colossal payments this year, our debts not only are not decreasing, but they are increasing. All the efforts of the central bank to promote the dollar and anti-Russian interests are well evaluated. Having begun with the modest authorized capital of 3 million rubles that I mentioned before, the participants of this corporation multiplied, within just 10 years, not only their personal assets, but also the capital of the company by their wear and tear work. So, only that part of the foreign exchange reserves of the central bank which is formed, as is known, from profits, exceeded $60 billion, and the debts of agriculture amounted to 350 billion rubles. The growth of the country's capital by hundreds of thousands of times is steep, even by Russian standards. I wish our peasants had such capital increase, as sometimes they work 7 days a week from dawn to dawn. June 21st, 2003, St. Petersburg State Polytechnic University held a conference named Fundamental Research in Technical Universities. The decision of the conference is fully based on the conception of social safety, dead water, and provides algorithms for achieving the objectives set by the President's address to the Federal Assembly on doubling the GDP and external convertibility of the ruble. This algorithm is based on the need for radical changes in the financial credit system and a reform of the central bank. I will quote some episodes concerning this decision. To radically reform the central bank, transfer the function of issuing means of payment to the Treasury, to release the energy ruble into circulation, to ensure the stability of the energy ruble on the basis of the transition from the gold invariant to the energy standard, introduce a legislative ban on usury, introduce a legislative ban on export deliveries in any currency other than for the Russian energy ruble. I would like to finish our program with the words of Saltykov-Shchedrin. Beware, gentlemen, because as soon as man understands what domestic politics is, nini, seifini, over. This is what our program serves.